With the RTX 5080 now here, there's been a lot of discussion around custom AIB models, especially with some brands sticking to their tried and tested designs, while others refine their cooling and aesthetics. One of the standout cards from ASUS is the RTX 5080 TUF OC, a card that builds on the robust and reliable design philosophy that the TUF lineup is known for. Given that Nvidia's Founders Edition has slimmed down this generation, we wanted to see what ASUS has done differently, and whether the larger TUF cooler can push performance further. So today, we'll be putting it through its paces. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor.
Alright, stay calm. You've got one job. Do not let this thing overheat.
It's running hot. How do I know if it's safe?
Get the WireView Pro.
The WireView Pro safeguards your graphics card with real-time power and temperature monitoring, acoustic alarms for custom thresholds, and sensor pin detection to ensure proper 12V PWR connection. External sensors can monitor additional components like memory or voltage regulators, while an OLED display provides instant insights, meaning that this is the last time you'll blow a 12V PWR connector, soldier. To keep your system protected, click the link in the description below. Now, just recently, we took a look at the RTX 5080 Founders from Nvidia, and being a MSRP-based card, anything that tries to compete with it is already on a bit of an uphill struggle, as we've already shown that the FE cooler is able to handle temperatures, power and fan noise with ease, which is where we're going to be putting our focus today, as underneath the TUF cooler from ASUS is the same GB203 core, so well, there's not really much point going over all of the same tests. Though as always, we will be making sure that the ASUS TUF OC card matches within the same range of performance that we saw with the Nvidia Founders Edition, before putting it under a stress test to see exactly how it holds up. Now before we do that, let's talk about the specs of this card, and being an OC-based card, naturally you'd expect it to come in with a factory overclock, of which it does, with a boost clock of 2700 MHz, which compared to the 2620 MHz of the Founders card means it is pushing another 3% faster speeds, which, well, when you put it like that, doesn't exactly sound amazing. And while overclocks in this day and age don't always provide a drastic increase in frame rates, in some cases we have seen up to a 10% improvement depending on the workload. However, that always brings us back to the value proposition. If a card delivers a 5 to 10% performance gain but costs 15 to 20% more, is it really worth it? Well, that's where cooling, noise levels and build quality start to factor into the decision-making process. And it will have to make a big difference with this one, because this card comes in, and you may want to be sitting down for this one, 49% more expensive than the Founders card. So yeah, it's a lot. Now, being a TUF card, for anyone who's had any TUF products before, you'll know that they've evolved significantly over the last few years. ASUS have refined the lineup, improving cooling performance and durability, while still keeping costs slightly lower than their premium ROG strict counterparts. Now, the TUF RTX 5080 OC features a triple fan design using AxialTech fans that ASUS claim provides increased airflow compared to previous generations. These fans also utilise a dual ball bearing system that are meant to last twice as long as standard sleeve bearing fans. To further enhance cooling, the TUF OC also has a high-density aluminium heatsink, which is designed to pull heat away from the GPU core and VRMs more efficiently than previous models of the same cooler. Though it is always hard to test these things because we don't have the existing cooler on, well, this GPU core. Now, additionally, ASUS have included their max contact technology, something that we mentioned on their 5090 Astral card, which again is meant to enhance heat transfer by creating an ultra-smooth surface on the GPU heatsink. This, in theory, allows for better contact with the GPU die and improves thermal efficiency. Though, again, and as we mentioned in our Astral review, we can't directly compare this to a model without it, so we kind of just, well, have to take their word for it. Now, while the TUF lineup is generally positioned below the ROG Strict series, ASUS hasn't skimped on build quality. The aluminium shroud and reinforced metal backplate ensure that the card is sturdy and rigid, reducing GPU sag, though ASUS do still include a support bracket in the box, just in case you kind of find it's maybe a slight issue for you. For additional flexibility, the TUF RTX 5080 OC features a dual BIOS switch, allowing users to choose between performance mode, so higher fan speeds and lower temps, or quiet mode, lower noise levels with slightly higher temps. RGB is kept to a minimum here, with only a subtle TUF logo on the side featuring ASUS AuraSync compatibility. But if you prefer a more understated look, this will likely appeal to you more than the kind of flashy designs of some competing models, and the fact that you can just turn it off completely if you want. Now, one area that might be of consideration is size. Unlike Nvidia's dual slot Founders Edition, the TUF RTX 5080 OC is a 3.6 slot card, meaning that it takes up almost 4 slots in a case. It measures in at 348mm in length, 146mm in height, and 72mm in thickness, making it larger than the RTX 5080 FE, but slightly more compact than some of the highest-end AIB models, again like the 5090 Astral. And this is definitely something to keep in mind if you're using a smaller case, because if you're building in something compact, the Founders Edition may actually be the better option. Now, in terms of power, the RTX 5080 TUF OC retains a single 12V 2x6 connector ready to supply up to 360 watts of rated power for the GPU. And being a TUF OC, well, it's highly likely that it's going to use that full 360 watts that it has at its disposal. Now, ASUS also recommends at least an 850 watt power supply, though if you're overclocking, then I'd say a 1000 watt unit might be more preferable, especially if paired with a high-end CPU like a Ryzen 9 9950X or Intel Core Ultra 9 285K. Now, speaking of overclocking, which is something you've all wanted back for quite some time, we were able to increase the core clock by a pretty staggering 500 MHz on the core clock, taking it up to 3200 MHz, along with the memory clock by 1000 MHz, now bringing it up to 2000. We also did increase the power limit to its maximum, taking it up to 111%, but it really didn't have any effective change on the overclock, its numbers, or, well, just general stability. Now, to get an idea of what both stock modes mean when compared to the Nvidia FE model and what the overclock means, we ran F124 for an hour-long loop to see just how the TUF OC performed under that sustained level of gaming, whilst keeping a watchful eye on the temperatures, fan speed, clock speeds, and, of course, power usage. It's here where straight off the bat, the TUF model demonstrated superior thermal efficiency compared to the Founders Edition, with an average GPU temperature of 59 degrees, with an average fan speed of 1300 RPM, while the Founders averaged 66 degrees at a slightly higher 1480 RPM. Now, the silent mode, as expected, traded some cooling efficiency for quieter operation, matching the Founder's temperature at 66 degrees, but at just 890 RPM, so it was whisper quiet and clearly doing what it was set out to do. Now, the overclock maintains solid thermal performance, averaging 60 degrees, so no change over the stock performance, though the fan speed did increase ever so slightly, but only to an average of 1350 RPM. The memory junction temperatures followed a similar pattern, with the TUF set to performance mode coming in at 60 degrees C, the silent BIOS seeing an increase coming in at 67 degrees C, and the overclock maintaining the same 60 degrees that we saw in performance mode, all while the Founders remain the warmest at 68 degrees C. What this means is that the overclock now sees a clock speed of around 3135 MHz and a memory clock of 2000 MHz, or 32 gigabits per second effective, which is a nice bump up from the TUF's performance mode setting, which is already a nice increase over the Founders model, which actually finds itself closer to the Silent Profile's clock speed. Now, in terms of power, the FE model used around 320 watts on average, while the TUF in performance mode ended up using 330 watts on average, so not much more. Though more interestingly, the Silent Profile actually used a little more power at 340 watts on average, which also matches exactly what our manual overclock was pulling too, though these are all within around 3% of each other, so nothing too drastic anyway. So what about real-world performance? Well, starting things off with a Plague Tale Requiem, the ASUS TUF Gaming OC shows a noticeable improvement over the Founders Edition at stock, delivering a healthy 9% uplift in the averages. The 1% lows also see a consistent improvement with the same 9% increase in frame rate, and collectively this puts the ASUS TUF Gaming OC only 5% behind the RTX 4090, a card that was and still is significantly more expensive. When overclocked, we managed to squeeze out another 2% performance, which now puts it 11% faster than the FE from Nvidia, so some good stuff, but not almost 50% good considering the price tag that it commands. In Black Myth Wukong, the ASUS TUF Gaming OC delivers a modest 4% improvement in the averages over the Founders Edition, reaching 57 frames per second, which, while this uplift isn't groundbreaking, it does indicate a small advantage for the custom-cooled card, though it is on the cusp of margin of error, so take that as you will. The 1% lows also follow the same trend with a 4% difference in favour to ASUS, which, considering this card has a hefty price premium over the Founders model, I think consumers won't be exactly flocking to buy it based on that. Now, the overclock does help with another 7% more performance over the stock result, which now equates to an 11% uplift over the FE, but the FE could be overclocked to bridge that gap anyway. In Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K Ultra, the ASUS TUF Gaming OC edges ahead of the Founders Edition with a pretty strong 10% uplift in the averages, reaching 65 frames per second. This performance also pushes it just past the RTX 4090 by a single frame, but is a marginal difference that likely won't be perceptible in real-world use, and could change if we carried on retesting anyway. However, the TUF Gaming OC does stand out in the 1% lows, achieving a 10% improvement over the Founders Edition and a 2% lead over the RTX 4090, offering smoother and more consistent performance during demanding moments. Now, when overclocked, we don't see nowhere near the same uplift as we'd seen previously, with just a single FPS difference in the averages, but interestingly now is that we lose performance in the lows by around 7%. In Indiana Jones and the Great Circle at 4K Ultra, the ASUS TUF Gaming OC delivers a 5% improvement in the averages over the Founders Edition, reaching 96 frames per second compared to the Founders' 91 FPS, providing a small but noticeable advantage in sustained performance. Again, the 1% lows show a much stronger 12% increase, further ensuring smoother gameplay during more demanding scenes. And though, while it doesn't surpass the RTX 4090, the TUF Gaming OC does narrow the gap, sitting only 9% behind in the averages, but does fall a significant 24% behind in the 1% lows. Though the overclock does help to narrow that margin, as we now have 6% more performance, putting it just 3 frames behind the RTX 4090. Though, again, it does suffer even more in the lows now. Looking at Starfield at 4K Ultra, the ASUS TUF Gaming OC delivers a 4% uplift in the averages over the Founders Edition, reaching 88 frames per second, compared to the Founders' 85 FPS, along with the 1% lows that showed the same 4% improvement, rising from 74 FPS on the Founders to 79 FPS on the TUF Gaming OC. While this performance is a modest improvement, I do feel that price disparity will throw any small gains like this out the window. And, well, that's the same argument even when overclocked, as we do find another 6% more performance, now putting it 9% ahead of the FE, and with improved lows again, but it's still pretty negligible in the grand scheme of things. Moving up to ray tracing performance and going back to Black Myth Wukong at 4K high with ray tracing set to medium, and here both the ASUS TUF Gaming OC and the Founders Edition deliver identical average performance at 31 frames per second. The 1% lows also remain fairly consistent across both cards, with the TUF card just edging ahead at 28 frames per second, which shows, well, no real benefit, with just 1 frame separating them in this scenario. This highlights that while the TUF Gaming OC offers other potential benefits, its gaming performance here doesn't differentiate itself from the Founders Edition, especially when you factor in the higher cost. Luckily, I guess you could say one of those saving graces is overclocking, as that manages to net us another 10% performance, which puts it closer to the RTX 4090. But, in all honesty, it still feels like it's falling just a little bit short. Then, lastly, in Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K Ultra with ray tracing set to Ultra, the ASUS TUF Gaming OC provides a modest 4% improvement in the averages over the Founders Edition, reaching 27 FPS compared to the Founders' 26. While this uplift in averages is minor and falls within margin of error, along with the same for the 1% lows, it's clear to see that the only saving grace in a title like this on these settings is through upscaling, as, well, no one wants to be playing at 26 to 27 frames per second anyway. And that's the same with overclocking, which gained us a margin of error 4% more performance, but at quite a big sacrifice in those all-important lows. So in terms of performance, for the most part, there really wasn't much in it between the TUF Gaming OC and the Founders Edition card. While the ASUS card does edge ahead in several tests, the gains are often modest and in many cases fall within margin of error or offer limited real-world benefits. The 9% improvement in A Plague Tale and the stronger 1% lows in titles like Cyberpunk are noteworthy, but across most other games the differences are just minor at best, and some of the 1% low figures are still all over the place, which, well, I think right now it's safe to say is a 50 series thing. And drivers are showing to actually improve upon that. Now, even looking at ray tracing scenarios, the TUF Gaming OC does struggle to differentiate itself meaningfully from the Founders Edition, with performance that either mirrors or just barely surpasses it. Ultimately, while ASUS delivers a well-engineered card, the performance improvements just don't quite justify that almost 50% markup in price premium for most gamers, especially given how close the Founders Edition remains in terms of overall gaming experience. And that's not even just me talking about stock performance. I mean, overclocking is a finicky thing, as while we did actually manage a 500 megahertz increase in the core clock, while tinkering around we were able to get much higher, and the same for the memory, bordering close to a 2200 megahertz increase. And most games were stable, with a few exceptions, which I guess if those are the numbers you're trying to hit, then a bit more refinement in terms of fan speeds could actually net you those gains. But we also have to remember that GDDR7 includes ECC at the chip level, similar to what we saw on GDDR6X. So if you go too far, you may actually find the potential performance gains decrease due to error correction mechanisms that are in place. So it's about finding that sweet spot, which I'd like to think is exactly what we did, but also finding that, it's just not enough. I think if the TUF card was closer to the $1,200 mark, I would be happy to recommend it. As a 20% markup for some extra performance, overclocking headroom, and a tried and tested method when it comes to the cooler, is definitely something that consumers would toy with. But at $1,500, I think it's a stretch too far. Though this is the price that we found on Newegg and have had, no concrete word on pricing from ASUS directly. Though it is, I guess, a slightly better story here in the UK, as Currys had it listed for £1,259 compared to the UK MSRP of $979. So only about a 29% price premium, which is definitely better, though still not great. So maybe Newegg are trying to profiteer off the 50 series. I've seen worse things happen, so I guess I wouldn't put it past them. Now, the cooling performance is strong, with the TUF card running cooler and quieter than the Founders Edition in performance mode, while also offering an even quieter experience in silent mode. The factory overclock maintains good thermal efficiency without excessive fan noise, which is something we've all come to expect with the TUF cooler, so nothing too out of the ordinary. And it did give us some extra headroom for overclocking, which didn't seem to affect temperatures really, at all. In terms of power consumption, it was increased over the Founders, but was still within reasonable levels that I think any consumer would expect if buying a pre-factory overclock card. All in all, the TUF card is good. It's just much of the same as what we've seen before. Don't get me wrong, it does give us some strong performance over the Founders model, and I fear this is going to happen every generation moving forward, that NVIDIA's MSRP-based FE is getting better and better, and that makes it harder and harder for AIBs to make things different while also making a good profit, while simultaneously not trying to rip consumers off. And I think maybe it's Newegg who have something to do with the pricing on this one, but I think with the lack of stock, some consumers are going to, have their hands forced a little bit by FOMO and wanting a 5080 regardless, which at $1,000 I still think is a good card, offering up a strong value perspective, at least when compared to other cards you can buy right now. But for another $491, you're talking about the price of a 7800 X3D, for instance. So not quite a 9800 X3D, but I can tell you now that an MSRP-based Founders 5080 and a 7800 X3D is going to give you a much bigger smile than a TUF OC. A shame really, as I really like the card, the design, the cooler, and kind of what it all stands for. But ultimately, the price trumps it all, and that's something I can't see changing anytime soon. For now, that's going to do it for the review of the RTX 5080 TUF OC from ASUS. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, then a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. Also, if you love what we do and simply can't get enough from us, then you can join the super special Patreon club, where you'll get exclusive access to behind-the-scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, Patreon meetups at the shiny new eTeknix offices, and much, much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.